Under the crystal chandeliers of the most exclusive charity gala in Manhattan, David Carter grabbed his wife Reba's wrist so hard she winced, and then he laughed. Right there, in front of 300 of New York's wealthiest power players, he told her she was nothing but a small-town embarrassment. His mistress Amanda stood 6 feet away, draped in diamonds he'd bought with Reba's inheritance. Every guest saw it. Every guest looked away. But what nobody saw, what nobody could have predicted, was Reba leaning toward the silver-haired CEO at the head table and whispering 7 words that would burn David's empire to ash before sunrise. Because the woman David had just humiliated in public? She was never the one without power. She was the one who had been choosing not to use it until now. What happens when a quiet woman stops being kind and starts being strategic? Stay until the end, because this story will shatter everything you think you know about revenge. The Grand Astoria ballroom smelled of old money and fresh orchids. 300 guests filled the room, hedge fund managers, media moguls, senators' wives, and tech billionaires, all dressed in black tie perfection, all performing the elaborate theater of American high society. The annual Carter Foundation Gala was the crown jewel of Manhattan's fall charity season, and for 6 consecutive years, it had raised more money for children's hospitals than any other private event on the Eastern Seaboard. But tonight, the gala was not about charity. Tonight, it was a stage, and every actor was about to forget their lines. Reba Carter stood near the entrance, adjusting the clasp on her simple pearl necklace, the one her mother had given her on her wedding day 11 years ago. The dress she wore was elegant, but understated, a deep navy gown she had found at a consignment boutique in Brooklyn, altered to fit her slender frame. She had done her own hair, pulling her chestnut waves into a low chignon, and her makeup was minimal. Reba had never been one for spectacle. She believed that substance spoke louder than sequins, and she had built her entire life on that principle. Her husband, David, didn't share this philosophy. David Carter moved through the ballroom like a man who owned every molecule of air in the room. At 43, he was handsome in the predatory way that Wall Street rewards: sharp jaw, expensive haircut, a smile that never quite reached his ice-blue eyes. His custom Brioni tuxedo cost more than most people's monthly rent, and the Patek Philippe on his wrist could fund a semester at an Ivy League school. He shook hands, slapped backs, and laughed with the deep, confident boom of a man who had never been told no. But David Carter's confidence was built on a foundation of sand, and the tide was coming in. "Reba, for God's sake, stand up straighter," he hissed as he passed her, not even bothering to stop. "You look like you're waiting for a bus." Reba felt the familiar sting of his words, but kept her expression neutral. She had learned, over 11 years of marriage, that showing pain was an invitation for more. So she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked toward the bar with the quiet dignity that had become her armor. What David didn't know, what he had never bothered to learn, was that Reba's quiet dignity was not weakness. It was patience, and patience, in the right hands, is the most dangerous weapon in the world. Across the ballroom, a woman in a crimson dress caught David's eye and smiled. Amanda Voss, 31 years old, blonde, sharp, hungry in a way that Reba had never been. She was David's executive assistant at Carter Capital Management, and she had been his mistress for the past 2 years. Everyone in their social circle suspected it. No one said a word. That was how things worked in their world. The men strayed, the wives stayed, and the silence was maintained like a garden wall, trimmed and perfect and utterly suffocating. Amanda raised her champagne glass to David from across the room, a gesture that was just intimate enough to be noticed, just subtle enough to be denied. On her wrist was a diamond tennis bracelet worth $40,000. It had been purchased 3 months ago from Tiffany's. It had been charged to a credit card that drew from an account funded entirely by Reba's family trust. Reba saw the gesture. She saw the bracelet. And for the first time in 2 years, something inside her chest shifted. Not broke, not cracked, but shifted, like tectonic plates adjusting before an earthquake. She didn't say a word. She simply turned toward the head table, where a silver-haired man in his 60s sat alone, studying the room with the calm, penetrating gaze of someone who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. His name was Daniel Mercer. He was the CEO of Meridian Holdings, the largest private equity firm on the Eastern Seaboard, and he was the single most powerful person in the room. He was also the man who had built the very fund that David Carter now managed, and the man who held David's professional fate in his manicured hands. Reba had known Daniel for years, not through David, but through her own quiet channels, charity boards, literacy programs, hospital fundraisers. They had developed a mutual respect built on shared values and honest conversation, the kind of relationship David would never understand because it wasn't transactional. She caught Daniel's eye. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, and in that small gesture, the first domino began to fall. The evening's program began at 8 o'clock sharp. David took the stage with the easy confidence of a man who had given this speech 6 times before. He stood behind the podium, the Carter Foundation logo glowing behind him in projected gold, and he delivered his opening remarks with practiced charm. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 6th annual Carter Foundation Gala. Tonight, we celebrate not just generosity, but legacy. The legacy of giving. The legacy of building something greater than ourselves. The audience applauded politely. Reba sat at the front table, her hands folded in her lap, watching her husband perform. She had written the first 3 versions of this speech. She had built the Carter Foundation from scratch, filing the paperwork, recruiting the board, designing the programs. She had done it all while David was busy building his career, busy climbing, busy being seen. The foundation was her creation, but David had long since claimed it as his own, and she had let him, because fighting David over credit had always felt like wrestling a crocodile, exhausting, dangerous, and ultimately pointless. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the script was about to change. David paused mid-speech and looked out at the audience with an expression of exaggerated warmth. And of course, none of this would be possible without the incredible team behind the scenes. My assistant Amanda Voss has been instrumental in organizing tonight's event. He gestured toward Amanda, who stood up gracefully, her crimson dress catching the light, and accepted the applause with a modest smile that was anything but modest. The audience clapped. Reba's stomach turned. He had not mentioned her. He had not mentioned the woman who had created the foundation, planned the first 3 galas, and donated the initial seed money from her own inheritance. He had mentioned his mistress instead. But Reba held still. She had learned to hold still. The speech ended. The dinner was served, and that was when the real performance began. David drank. He drank the way he always drank at these events. Too much, too fast, with the careless entitlement of a man who believed consequences were for other people. By the time the main course was cleared, his cheeks were flushed, and his voice had grown louder, his laughter sharper, his cruelty closer to the surface. It happened during the dessert course. Reba had been speaking with Margaret Ashworth, a 70-year-old philanthropist who sat on the boards of 3 major hospitals and who had always treated Reba with genuine kindness. They were discussing a new literacy initiative when David appeared at the table, swaying slightly, a glass of bourbon in his hand. "Reba's telling you about her little reading project, is she?" David said, his voice carrying across the table. "That's cute. She loves her little projects. Keeps her busy while the adults do the real work." The table went silent. Margaret Ashworth's smile froze. Two couples at the adjacent table turned to stare. Reba felt the blood drain from her face. "David, oh, don't start," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "You know I'm joking. Everyone knows I'm joking. Reba's from a small town in Pennsylvania. Did you all know that? Little place called Millhaven. Population of what, 12? She's done very well for herself, all things considered." He said it the way someone might compliment a dog for learning a trick. The condescension dripped from every syllable. But he wasn't finished. He turned to the broader table. 8 people, all watching with the frozen discomfort of witnesses to a car crash, and he delivered the line that would change everything. "I mean, look at her." He gestured at Reba with his bourbon glass, some of the liquid sloshing over the rim. "She's wearing a dress from a thrift store, at a gala, my gala. You can take the girl out of Millhaven, but you can't take Millhaven out of the girl, am I right?" He laughed. It was a big, booming laugh, the kind that demands company. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the nearby guests, the cowardly laughter of people who knew they should object, but lacked the courage. Amanda, standing behind David like a shadow in red silk, smiled. Reba looked down at her plate. Her hands were trembling, but when she looked up, her eyes were dry, and they were absolutely clear. She excused herself from the table with a quiet, "Pardon me," set her napkin beside her untouched dessert, and walked, not ran, not fled, but walked, toward the head table where Daniel Mercer sat, watching everything with those calm, knowing eyes. She leaned down and whispered 7 words into Daniel's ear. 7 words that would detonate David Carter's entire world. "It's time I showed you the documents." Daniel Mercer looked up at her, and for the first time all evening, he smiled. What David Carter did not know, what he had never considered possible, because narcissists rarely imagine consequences, was that his empire was a house of cards built over a trap door, and his wife had been holding the lever for 2 years. It had started innocently enough. 18 months ago, Reba had been organizing the household finances for tax season, something David had always left to her because he considered it beneath him. She was meticulous by nature, the kind of woman who balanced checkbooks to the penny and kept receipts in labeled folders. It was a quality David mocked as provincial and obsessive. It was also the quality that would destroy him. While reconciling the accounts, Reba noticed a discrepancy. A transfer of $75,000 from the family trust, her family trust, funded by money her late father had earned over 40 years of building a construction company in Millhaven, to an account she didn't recognize. She dug deeper. Then deeper still, and what she found was a labyrinth of financial deception so intricate and so brazen that it took her 3 months just to map its outlines. David had been siphoning money from the family trust for years. Not just thousands, millions. He had created a network of shell companies with names like Granite Peak Holdings and Lakeshore Capital Partners that existed only on paper, and he had been funneling money through them into private accounts. Some of the money went to Amanda, the apartment on the Upper West Side, the diamond bracelet, the trips to St. Bart's, but most of it went somewhere far more dangerous. David had been using the embezzled funds to make unauthorized investments through Carter Capital Management, the fund he managed under the umbrella of Daniel Mercer's Meridian Holdings. He was making high-risk bets with stolen money, hoping to generate returns large enough to cover his tracks. It was fraud. It was embezzlement, and it was a violation of every fiduciary regulation on the books. Reba had discovered all of this 18 months ago, and she had said nothing. Not because she was weak, not because she was afraid, but because she was strategic. She had spent those 18 months quietly, methodically gathering evidence. She hired a forensic accountant, a woman named Patricia Huang, recommended by her college roommate who worked at the SEC. Patricia had spent 6 months following the money trail, documenting every transaction, every shell company, every fraudulent transfer. Reba had copies of bank statements, wire transfer records, corporate filings, and email correspondence that David had carelessly left accessible on the family computer. She had organized it all into a dossier, 347 pages, indexed, cross-referenced, devastating. She had also quietly consulted with a divorce attorney, one of the best in New York, a woman named Sandra Chu, who had represented the wives of 3 different Fortune 500 CEOs in high-profile divorces and had never lost a case. Sandra had reviewed the evidence and told Reba, with the calm assurance of a surgeon before an operation, that David would lose everything. But Reba had waited. She had waited because she wanted the moment to be right. She wanted David to be standing at the very peak of his arrogance, surrounded by everyone who mattered in his world, believing himself invincible, so that when the ground opened beneath him, the fall would be absolute. Tonight was that moment. What David also didn't know was that Amanda Voss was not simply his mistress. Amanda was playing her own game, and she was playing it with a ruthlessness that would have impressed David himself if he weren't the target. Amanda had grown up in Atlantic City, the daughter of a casino floor manager and a cocktail waitress. She had clawed her way through community college and a state university, earned an MBA through sheer force of will, and landed at Carter Capital Management with a single, crystalline objective: wealth. Not the kind of wealth you earn, the kind you take. She had seduced David not out of attraction, but out of calculation. She had studied him the way a poker player studies an opponent, identifying his weaknesses, his ego, his carelessness, his need to be admired, and she had exploited every single one. She had access to his email, she had copies of his passwords, and she had been quietly building her own file of evidence, not to expose him, but to leverage him. Amanda's plan was simple. When the time was right, she would present David with a choice: marry her and give her everything she wanted, or she would hand his financial records to the SEC herself. It was blackmail dressed in Chanel, and she had been perfecting it for months. But Amanda had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated the quiet woman in the navy dress. Because while Amanda was building her trap, Reba had already built a bigger one. And tonight, both traps would spring at once. Back at the gala, David was still laughing, still holding court, still basking in the glow of his own reflection. He had no idea that the 2 women in his life, the one he mocked and the one he desired, had both been watching him the way hawks watch a field mouse, and the hawk always strikes when the mouse feels safest. Daniel Mercer's private study at the Grand Astoria was a room that most gala guests didn't know existed. Tucked behind a mahogany door off the main corridor, it was reserved for the hotel's most distinguished clients, a quiet space with leather chairs, a fireplace, and the kind of silence that money buys. It was here that Daniel led Reba after she whispered those 7 devastating words. "Show me," he said simply, settling into a wingback chair and crossing his legs with the patience of a man who had built a $12 billion empire by listening more than he spoke. Reba opened her clutch, the small, unassuming clutch that David had mocked as cheap, and produced a USB drive. She handed it to Daniel with steady hands. "Everything is on there," she said. 347 pages. Bank records, wire transfers, shell company registrations, email correspondence. Patricia Huang, she's a forensic accountant, formerly with Deloitte, compiled the full audit. My attorney Sandra Chu has reviewed everything and confirmed it's actionable. Daniel plugged the USB into his laptop and began scrolling. The room was silent, except for the soft crackle of the fireplace and the distant murmur of the Gala on the other side of the wall. As he read, Reba watched his face. Daniel Mercer was not a man who showed emotion easily. He had survived 3 market crashes, a hostile takeover attempt, and a congressional investigation with the same unflappable composure. But as the pages scrolled past, the shell companies, the unauthorized trades, the siphoned millions, Reba saw something shift behind his grey eyes. It wasn't surprise. It was confirmation. "I suspected," Daniel said quietly, not looking up from the screen. 12 months ago, my internal auditors flagged some irregularities in David's portfolio performance. The returns were too consistent, too clean. I asked David about it directly, and he explained it away with market analysis and proprietary algorithms. I accepted his explanation because I wanted to believe it. That was my mistake. He looked up at Reba. "I won't make it again." "There's more," Reba said. She sat down across from him, her posture straight, her voice measured. She was not performing, she was reporting. The money David used for these unauthorized investments came from my family trust. My father built that trust over 40 years. David has drained approximately $4.7 million from it without my knowledge or consent. That's not just a regulatory violation. It's theft. Daniel closed the laptop slowly. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man making a decision that would reshape an industry. "Reba, I want you to understand what happens next. When this comes to light, and it will, because I have a legal and fiduciary obligation to act on this information, David won't just lose his position at Carter Capital. He'll face criminal charges, SEC investigation, probable prison time. The fund will be frozen pending investigation. Investors will panic. It will be a catastrophe of the first order." "I understand," Reba said. "And you're prepared for that? The publicity, the scrutiny, the—" "Daniel!" Reba's voice was quiet but absolute. "He took my father's money. He gave it to his mistress. He used the rest to commit fraud. And tonight, in front of 300 people, he called me an embarrassment." She paused. "I am not asking for your sympathy. I am giving you the evidence you need to protect your firm, your investors, and yourself. What you do with it is your decision. But I will tell you this. I have already made mine." Daniel studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I'll have my legal team on this within the hour. I'm also going to make a phone call to the SEC's Enforcement Division. I have a contact there. Someone I trust. This will move quickly." "Good," Reba said. She stood up, smoothed her navy dress, and walked toward the door. Then she paused and turned back. "Daniel, one more thing. You should know that Amanda Voss, David's assistant, has been gathering her own evidence against him. I don't know her full plan, but I know she has leverage, and she intends to use it. You may want to factor that into your calculations." Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly, the closest he ever came to expressing shock. "How do you know this?" Reba allowed herself the smallest of smiles. "Because I've been watching everyone, Daniel, for 18 months. That's what people do when they're underestimated. They watch." She stepped back into the corridor and closed the door behind her. The hallway was empty. The Gala continued its glittering charade on the other side of the wall, the music and laughter muffled to a soft roar. Reba stood alone for a moment, her back against the cool mahogany door, and breathed. Then she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked back into the ballroom. The detonation had begun. David just didn't know it yet. The next 72 hours unfolded with the merciless precision of a controlled demolition. Monday morning, David Carter walked into his corner office at Carter Capital Management with a large coffee and his usual air of untouchable confidence. His weekend had been pleasant. A brunch with Amanda at their favorite spot in Tribeca, a round of golf at his club in Westchester, a few phone calls to investors who told him what he wanted to hear. The gala had been a success, he thought. Sure, he'd been a little rough on Reba, but she was used to it. She always forgave him. That was what she did. That was what she was for. His assistant, Amanda, was already at her desk when he arrived, looking polished and composed in a cream blouse and tailored slacks. She smiled at him, and he winked, and for a brief moment, the world was exactly as David believed it should be, him at the center, everyone else in orbit. Then his phone rang. It was Daniel Mercer's office. David's stomach didn't drop, not yet, but something flickered across his face. Daniel never called on Mondays. Daniel communicated through scheduled meetings and carefully worded emails. A Monday morning phone call was irregular, and David, for all his flaws, had a predator's instinct for irregularity. "David, I need you in my office at 11 sharp, Daniel's executive assistant said. Her voice was neutral, professional, and completely devoid of warmth. Mr. Mercer will be joined by the firm's general counsel and the head of compliance. The flicker became a flame. General counsel and compliance. That was not a routine meeting. That was an intervention. Of course, David said smoothly, masking the first tremor of unease. Can I ask what this is regarding? Mr. Mercer will discuss that with you directly. The line went dead. David spent the next 2 hours at his desk, his mind racing through every possible scenario. Had an investor complained? Had one of his trades triggered a regulatory flag? He opened his private files and began reviewing his shell company records, looking for anything that might have surfaced. His hands were steady, but a thin film of sweat had appeared on his forehead. Amanda noticed. She always noticed. She came into his office with a fresh coffee and closed the door behind her. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing," David said. "Meeting with Daniel. Probably a performance review." Amanda studied him with those sharp, hazel eyes. She knew he was lying. She always knew. But she said nothing. She had her own plans, and they required David to remain functional for at least a little longer. She couldn't have him panicking. "You'll be fine," she said, touching his hand. "You always are." At 11 o'clock, David walked into Daniel Mercer's office on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Holdings Tower. The room was enormous, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, a conference table that could seat 20, and original art on the walls that was worth more than most people's homes. But today, the room felt small, suffocating. Daniel sat at the head of the table. To his right was Eleanor Vance, Meridian's general counsel, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the expression of someone who had spent 30 years delivering bad news. To Daniel's left was Robert Kim, the head of compliance, who had a thick folder open in front of him and was not making eye contact with anyone. "Sit down, David," Daniel said. David sat. He crossed his legs. He smiled. "What's this about, Daniel?" "You've got my attention." Daniel did not smile back. He slid a printed document across the table, a single page, but David recognized the formatting immediately. It was a wire transfer record, his wire transfer record. From the family trust to Granite Peak Holdings. The room tilted. "We have 347 pages of documentation," Daniel said, his voice as calm and final as a closing bell. Shell companies, unauthorized trades, embezzled funds, every transaction traced, every account identified. Our legal team has been working since Saturday night, and the SEC has been formally notified as of 9 o'clock this morning. David's mouth opened. No sound came out. Your access to all Carter Capital systems has been revoked as of this meeting, Eleanor Vance said, her voice carrying the clinical precision of a scalpel. Your security credentials have been deactivated. Your personal effects will be packed and delivered to your home address. You are terminated, effective immediately, for cause. David found his voice. It came out cracked and thin, a pale imitation of the booming confidence he'd displayed at the gala. This is a misunderstanding. Who gave you this? Who? He stopped. His face went white. Reba. Daniel said nothing. His silence was confirmation enough. She doesn't know what she's talking about, David said, his voice rising. She's a housewife. She files receipts. She doesn't understand complex financial. She understood it well enough to hire a forensic accountant who spent 6 months documenting your fraud. Daniel interrupted quietly. She understood it well enough to build a case that our own legal team says is airtight. And she understood it well enough to bring it to me at exactly the right moment. He paused. David, I suggest you contact an attorney. You're going to need one. David stood up so fast, his chair rolled backward and hit the window. His face was red, his hands were shaking, and in that moment, stripped of his charm and his confidence and his carefully constructed facade, he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had cheated and stolen and lied his way to the top, and who had just run out of road. He stormed out of the office without another word. He never set foot in the building again. David made it as far as the parking garage before his phone buzzed. A text from Amanda. Come to my apartment. Now. We need to talk. He drove to her Upper West Side apartment in a daze, running 2 red lights and nearly sideswiping a delivery truck on Columbus Avenue. His mind was a hurricane of rage and panic. Reba had done this. Quiet, meek, thrift store Reba had dismantled his life while he wasn't looking. The humiliation was almost worse than the legal exposure. The idea that she had outsmarted him, that she had been working against him while he mocked her, was a poison he couldn't swallow. He burst through Amanda's door without knocking. She was sitting on the white leather sofa in her living room. The living room he had paid for with Reba's money, looking immaculate and composed, her legs crossed, a glass of white wine in her hand. Sit down, David, she said. The same words Daniel had used, but where Daniel's tone had been judicial, Amanda's was something else, something colder. They know everything, David said, pacing. Daniel, the lawyers, compliance. They have the shell companies, the transfers, everything. Reba gave it to them. My own wife. I know, Amanda said. David stopped pacing. He looked at her. Something in her tone had snagged on a tripwire in his brain. What do you mean? You know? Amanda took a sip of wine. I mean, I know about the documents. I know about the forensic accountant. I know about Sandra Chu. I've known for months. The room was very quiet. You've known? David's voice was barely a whisper. Amanda uncrossed her legs and stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the city. Her city now, or so she believed. David, I'm going to be very honest with you, because I think you deserve that. I've been planning this for over a year. Not the same thing Reba planned. She wanted justice. I wanted something more practical. She turned to face him. Her expression was not cruel, exactly. It was clinical, the face of someone completing a transaction. I have copies of everything. Your emails, your account passwords, your financial records. I have recordings of conversations where you discussed the shell companies. I have photographs of documents you left on your desk." She paused. "I was going to use all of it to convince you to leave Reba and marry me. And if you refused, I was going to take it to the SEC myself and to the press. Either way, I would have ended up exactly where I wanted to be." David stared at her. The woman he had thought was his escape, his reward, his beautiful secret. She was a predator. She had been hunting him the same way he had been hunting Reba's money. The symmetry was so perfect, it was almost poetic. "But Reba beat me to it," Amanda continued, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed her face. Not remorse, but irritation. Professional irritation, the way a chess player looks when an opponent makes an unexpected move. "She moved faster than I expected. I underestimated her. We both did." "So what now?" David asked. His voice was hollow. Amanda picked up her phone from the coffee table and showed him the screen. It was an email from Eleanor Vance, Meridian's general counsel, sent 30 minutes ago. "They know about me too," Amanda said. "Reba told Daniel about my leverage file. They've launched a separate investigation into my activities. My access has been revoked. I've been terminated." She set the phone down. "We're both finished, David." David sank onto the sofa. He put his head in his hands, and for the first time in his adult life, David Carter had absolutely nothing to say. But the universe, it turned out, was not finished with either of them. 3 days later, Amanda Voss was served with a subpoena from the SEC's Enforcement Division. She was named as a co-conspirator in the fraud scheme, not merely an accessory. The forensic accountant's records showed that Amanda had actively participated in creating 2 of the shell companies and had personally directed several wire transfers. She had not just known about the fraud. She had helped build it. Amanda's leverage file, her insurance policy, her ticket to wealth and power, became the very evidence that sealed her own fate. Every recording, every photograph, every document she had gathered to blackmail David now demonstrated her intimate involvement in the conspiracy. The hunter had become the hunted, and the trap she had built had closed around her own neck. Meanwhile, Reba Carter sat in Sandra Chu's office on Park Avenue, signing the divorce papers that would formally end her marriage. Sandra had negotiated a settlement that was, by any measure, extraordinary. Full recovery of the stolen trust funds, the Manhattan townhouse, primary custody of their 2 children, and a restraining order that would keep David 500 feet from her at all times. "How do you feel?" Sandra asked, sliding the final document across the desk. Reba signed her name in clean, steady script. "I feel," she said, "like I just walked out of a house that was on fire, and I'm standing in the sunlight." Sandra smiled. "That's a good way to feel." Reba gathered her copies of the documents, placed them neatly in her bag, and stood up. "Thank you, Sandra, for everything." "Thank you, Reba. You did the hard part. All of it." Reba walked out into the October afternoon. The air was crisp, the sky a clear, unbroken blue, and the city hummed around her with the indifferent energy of 8 million lives in motion. She felt, for the first time in 11 years, that she was one of them. Free, moving, alive. 6 months later, the courtroom on Center Street in Lower Manhattan was standing room only. The trial of David Carter had drawn media attention that rivaled a political scandal, and every seat in the gallery was filled with reporters, investors, and curiosity seekers who had followed the story through months of headlines. David sat at the defense table in a suit that no longer fit quite right. He had lost weight. Not the healthy, disciplined weight loss of a man in control, but the gaunt, hollowed-out thinning of someone who had stopped sleeping. His legal team, 3 attorneys from a firm that charged $800 an hour, sat beside him with the grim expressions of surgeons who knew the patient was terminal. The evidence was overwhelming. Patricia Huang, Reba's forensic accountant, testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through the labyrinth of shell companies, fraudulent transfers, and unauthorized trades with the methodical precision of a woman who had spent her career following money to the places people tried to hide it. The jury watched, took notes, and did not smile. David's defense was essentially that Reba had misunderstood the finances, that the shell companies were legitimate tax planning vehicles, that the transfers were authorized. His attorneys presented their arguments with professional competence, but even they seemed to know they were rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. The prosecution called Reba as a witness. She took the stand in a charcoal blazer and pearl earrings, the same pearls her mother had given her, and she testified with a clarity and composure that silenced the courtroom. She described the discovery of the discrepancies, the months of investigation, the forensic audit, and the night at the gala when she had decided to act. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She spoke the truth the way she had always lived it, quietly, precisely, and with an integrity that was impossible to fake. When the defense attorney cross-examined her, he tried to paint her as a vindictive wife seeking revenge against a cheating husband. Reba looked at him with those clear brown eyes and said simply, "I didn't do this because he cheated on me. I did this because he stole from my family." There's a difference. The courtroom was silent for 3 full seconds after she said it. Then the judge called a recess. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all 12 counts: wire fraud, securities fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and 8 additional charges related to the shell company scheme. David stood motionless as the verdicts were read, his face a mask of disbelief that slowly, visibly, crumbled into the expression of a man who had finally understood that actions have consequences. The sentencing hearing, 2 months later, was brief. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Honorable Patricia Walsh, delivered a sentence of 14 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 7. "Mr. Carter," Judge Walsh said, looking down at him with an expression that combined judicial authority with something close to personal contempt. "You were entrusted with the financial security of your clients and your family. You betrayed that trust systematically, deliberately, and without remorse. The court sees no evidence of genuine contrition, only regret at being caught." David was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. As he passed the gallery, he turned his head and looked for Reba. She was there, in the 3rd row, sitting straight-backed and still. Their eyes met for 2 seconds. Reba did not look away. She did not flinch. She simply held his gaze with the same quiet dignity that he had mocked at the gala, and then she turned her head and looked forward. It was the last time she ever looked at him. Amanda Voss fared only slightly better. Her cooperation with the SEC, she had ultimately agreed to testify against David in exchange for a reduced sentence, earned her a plea deal. 5 years in federal prison, with eligibility for early release after 3. But the plea deal came with conditions: full forfeiture of all assets acquired during the period of the fraud, including the apartment, the jewelry, and the contents of every account David had funded. Amanda walked into the federal minimum security facility in Danbury, Connecticut, with exactly what she had arrived in New York with years before. Nothing. The irony was not lost on anyone. Daniel Mercer held a press conference the day after the sentencing. He stood before a bank of cameras and microphones, looking every inch the elder statesman of American finance, and he announced a comprehensive overhaul of Meridian Holdings' internal oversight systems. He pledged full restitution to affected investors. He announced a new whistleblower protection program. And at the very end of his statement, he said something that made headlines the next morning. I want to acknowledge one person whose courage and integrity made this accountability possible. Reba Carter came to me with evidence that was painful to compile and difficult to share. She did it not for revenge, but for justice. In my 40 years in this industry, I have rarely encountered that kind of moral courage. Meridian Holdings is grateful, and I am personally grateful. Reba, watching the press conference from her living room in the Manhattan townhouse that was now hers alone, turned off the television and went to make dinner for her children. She didn't need the praise. She never had. 1 year after the gala, the brownstone on East 74th Street was quieter now, a different kind of quiet than before. Not the tense, suffocating silence of a house where a woman walked on eggshells, but the warm, breathing quiet of a home where someone was finally at peace. Reba stood in the kitchen, slicing strawberries for her daughter Emma's lunchbox, while her son James sat at the breakfast table doing math homework with the intense concentration of a 9-year-old who had recently decided that fractions were his mortal enemy. The morning light came through the window in golden slants, catching the dust motes in the air and turning them into tiny constellations. It was ordinary, beautifully, perfectly ordinary. In the month since the trial, Reba had rebuilt her life with the same quiet, methodical care she brought to everything. She had expanded the Carter Foundation, now renamed the Mill Haven Foundation after her hometown, into a national organization with chapters in 12 states. The literacy programs she had created were now serving over 15,000 children. She had been invited to speak at conferences, to sit on boards, to advise other organizations on building sustainable charitable infrastructure. She accepted some of these invitations and politely declined others, because she had learned that the most powerful word in the English language is no, spoken with kindness and without apology. She had also started writing, not the grant proposals and strategic plans she had written for years, but something more personal, a memoir about growing up in Mill Haven, about her father who built houses and her mother who taught elementary school, about the values they had instilled in her that no amount of Manhattan glamour could erase. A literary agent had read the first 50 pages and called her, barely containing her excitement, to say that 3 major publishers were interested. "Is it a revenge book?" the agent had asked carefully. "No," Reba had said. "It's a love letter. To the people who raised me to know the difference between what matters and what glitters." Daniel Mercer had become something Reba had not expected, a genuine friend. They met once a month for coffee at a quiet cafe on Madison Avenue, where they discussed philanthropy, business ethics, and the particular challenges of rebuilding trust after betrayal. Daniel had offered Reba a seat on Meridian's advisory board, and after careful consideration, she had accepted. Not for the prestige, but because she believed she could help the firm build better systems to prevent what David had done from ever happening again. "You know," Daniel said to her one morning over his espresso, "I've been in this business for 40 years. I've worked with presidents, prime ministers, and people who could buy small countries. And I want you to know something, Reba." "What's that?" "You're the most formidable person I've ever met. And I don't say that because of what you did to David. I say it because of how you did it. With patience, with evidence, with integrity. You could have screamed. You could have made a scene. You could have gone to the tabloids and turned your life into a spectacle. But you didn't. You did it right." Reba smiled, a real smile, warm and unguarded, the kind of smile that David had never seen because he had never earned it. "My father used to say something," she said. "He'd come home from work covered in sawdust and plaster, and he'd sit at the kitchen table and say, 'Reba, the foundation is the part nobody sees, but it's the part that holds everything up.' I didn't understand it when I was little. I do now." She sipped her coffee and looked out the window at the city moving past, the taxis, the pedestrians, the endless current of lives flowing by. Somewhere in a federal prison in Pennsylvania, David Carter was wearing khaki and eating breakfast in a cafeteria. Somewhere in Connecticut, Amanda Voss was counting the days until her earliest possible release. Their stories continued, diminished and constrained, in the places where choices lead when those choices are built on selfishness and deception. But Reba's story was expanding, growing, taking root in solid ground. That evening, she picked up Emma and James from school. Emma was 7 and had recently lost her first tooth. James was 9 and had decided he wanted to be an architect, like his grandfather. They walked home through Central Park, kicking through the fallen leaves, arguing about whether dogs or cats were better, and laughing at absolutely nothing in the way that children do when they feel safe. Reba watched them run ahead on the path, their backpacks bouncing, their voices carrying through the autumn air, and she felt something rise in her chest. Not triumph, not vindication, but something deeper and quieter and infinitely more sustaining. Gratitude. For the parents who had raised her, for the strength she had discovered in herself, for the quiet courage it takes to stand in the truth when everyone around you is performing a lie. For the knowledge that justice is not a grand gesture, it is a daily practice, a choice made again and again in the small, unglamorous moments when no one is watching. She had been laughed at. She had been humiliated. She had been stolen from, lied to, and dismissed as nothing more than a small-town girl who didn't belong in the big room. And she had answered all of it, not with anger, not with spectacle, but with the one thing her enemies never had and never would: the truth. Reba Carter walked home through the golden afternoon light, her children running ahead, her head held high, and her foundation, the one nobody could see, holding everything up. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room is carrying the heaviest weapon. And that weapon is the truth. David Carter laughed at his wife because he confused silence with weakness. Amanda Voss underestimated her because she confused patience with ignorance. And both of them learned the same devastating lesson. The people you dismiss are the ones you should fear most, because they've been watching, waiting, and building a case you'll never see coming until it's too late. This story isn't just about betrayal and revenge. It's about the difference between power that comes from noise and power that comes from integrity. David had the spotlight, the title, and the applause, but Reba had the receipts, the resilience, and the moral clarity to use them at exactly the right moment. In a world that rewards the loudest voice, remember this: foundations are built in silence, and the foundation is the part that holds everything up. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the quiet people in your own life who deserve more credit than they get, then do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story. Drop a comment below telling me, who is the Reba in your life? Who's the person everyone underestimated who turned out to be the strongest one in the room? I want to hear your stories because every single one of them matters. Until next time, stay patient, stay honest, and never underestimate a woman with a plan.